Hi, everybody. I hope this is recording and am going to use this lecture to give you a little bit of background about the Pre-Raphaelites, specifically Dante Gabriel and Christina Rossetti. There are a lot of other Pre-Raphaelites, some of whom are in the Norton, but for today, I think we'll have plenty to do just to focus on these two. And I'm mostly going to talk about Dante Gabriel today, hoping that when I get to see you on Zoom, we can pay more attention to Christina as well. And my intention today is really just to provide some background rather than to give you an exhaustive interpretation of the art and poetry of these. It's more important to me just to give you some historical ways of understanding where the Pre-Raphaelites are coming from. So I want to talk about shocking the bourgeoisie, backgrounds to the Pre-Raphaelites as what I'll call a proto-avant-garde, and what that means and where that comes from. Talk a little bit about the visual background to Pre-Raphaelite art. Talk about some poetic background to the way they write poetry, and then pose some questions that we might think about in relation to three of the poems that you'll be reading, The Blessed Damozel and Jenny by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and then Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. So, the Pre-Raphaelites are interesting because they start out as a really quite small group of artists who go on to have an improbably large influence in North America and Europe. By the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, the Pre-Raphaelites seem to be everywhere, both in high elite culture and in popular culture. And it isn't that hard to make links between Pre-Raphaelite art in England and major figures elsewhere in Europe. The Pre-Raphaelites like to use PRB as a little code for the writers and artists associated with that group. So I want to park a little bit on this name, Pre-Raphaelite. What does that mean? Where is that coming from? And to introduce this, a kind of scary block of theory from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu from his field of cultural production. I like Bourdieu's book because it's an attempt to describe literature and art more generally without any of the traditional literary tools. He provides no close reading. He really is not interested in authorial biography. He's not interested in editorial apparatuses, etc. Instead, he adopts a systemic approach to cultural production and isn't afraid of big crashing generalizations, such as the one that I've put up here. The literary or artistic field is at all times, what a thing to say, at all times, the site of a struggle between the two principles of hierarchization. The heteronymous principle, favorable to those who dominate the field economically and politically, e.g. bourgeois art, and the autonomous principle, e.g. art for art's sake, which are those of its advocates who are least endowed with specific capital tend to identify with degree of independence from the economy, seeing temporal failure as a sign of election and success as a sign of compromise. Well, that is a mouthful, but to try to unpack a little bit of what Bourdieu is describing here. He wants to describe the artistic field, meaning all the conditions that allow art to be produced, as the site of a struggle between these two principles, heteronymous and autonomous. What in the world does that mean? What are these principles? The heteronymous principle is the principle that wants to see art as not just about art. Art is valuable because it relays certain moral positions, certain economic positions, political positions, religious positions, and that is what matters about art. And he associates this with bourgeois art, with art conveying principles of morality, and opposes this to the autonomous principle, art for art's sake, in which the claim is art exists only for itself, not to convey any moral, not to preach any particular ideology. The only justification for art is art. And he notes that those who advocate for the autonomous principle are those who are least endowed with specific capital. Translation, they're poor, they tend not to have money, and they identify their independence from the economy, the fact that they have no money, as a sign of success. Seeing temporal failure, meaning the fact that nobody knows about them or values their art, as a sign of election, meaning that in their eyes, that means the art is good, and success as a sign of compromise. Well, all this is a big mouthful, but I think these issues still remain very pertinent today around, for example, debates about whether a particular artist has sold out. And they play into issues of appropriation as well, when mainstream, often white artists are seen as taking the aesthetic capital of more marginalized artists. How do we understand that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Bourdieu really isn't interested in reading it in moral terms, but structural terms, saying that such a struggle is fundamental to the way the artistic field has structured itself or come to be structured. So, what do we do with all that? Well, let's get back to the Pre-Raphaelites. One way that they mark their independence from bourgeois art is giving themselves a weird name. What exactly does Pre-Raphaelite mean anyway? Well, to have a linguistic moment, the term has three morphemes. There's the bound morpheme pre, which is a prefix meaning before. Then there's the root, Raphael, who's, of course, a Renaissance painter. And then the suffix, ite, which means, in this context, in the style of. So we've got pre, we've got Raphael, and we have ite. Now, there's a puzzle. And the puzzle is, how do you put these three morphemes together? There are two options. First, you can have pre-Raphaelite, and that means before whatever Raphaelite or Raphaelitism is understood to be. And the second is Pre-Raphaelite, in the manner of those artists who painted before Raphael. So are you before, or in the case of the PRB, rejecting Raphaelitism, or are you holding up the aesthetics of those before Raphael, which for them was a shorthand for the medieval? The history of Pre-Raphaelite art is a movement from the left-hand column, before or against, for them, Raphaelitism, to the right column, elevating medieval art, from a rebellion against Raphaelitism to an investment in the medieval art before Raphael. But what did they mean by Raphaelitism? What in the world is that? It comes from the way these artists had been taught art at the Royal Academy, which in England was the place to study art. At the Royal Academy, certain, not all, certain paintings, actually cartoons by Raphael, were held up as a model for what all art should be. These cartoons, I think there are about 6 of them, were presented to aspiring young artists as the perfection of art. And the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood hated not so much Raphael as the institutionalization of Raphael at the Royal Academy and the way principles had been derived from these cartoons that were used to decide what counted as good and bad art. So let's look at some of these Raphael cartoons here. We have the miraculous draft of fishes. We have the death of Ananias. Here we have the healing of the lame man by Jesus. So I'm not going to show you all the cartoons, but just looking at these 3 again, they share some traits in common. And these were, as I said, kind of extracted as a series of rules. To summarize them, first, sacred subjects. These are all from the New Testament, the Gospels, or the Acts of the Apostles. The background tends to be minimized, sketched in. Instead, the foreground is dominated by what I call a sculpted crowd, a very deliberately arranged set of people, arranged in terms of balancing. So if there's a clump on the right, it has to be balanced by a clump on the left. If there is height in one clump, it has to be balanced by lowness or depth in another clump. And that's what I mean by sculpted. So the crowd, all these people, are abstracted from the individuality. What matters is the overall shape that they create. That's what I mean by sculpted crowd. In addition, the individual faces in these paintings, although there are quite a few of them, are relatively generic. The bodies are idealized, not especially specific. And probably what you noticed, there's a degree of clutter to these paintings. There's a lot going on, although it's, as I suggested, highly organized clutter. The paintings, the sculpted crowd, another aspect of the sculpting is that your eye is guided to what the main point, the focus of the painting is, and then carefully the secondary issues and even tertiary issues are put in less definition, less focus, often less detail as well. So the painting is not an attempt to represent quote unquote reality. This is not a photographic sense of painting, but rather painting as a highly artificial attempt to guide the attention capacities of the human vision. And the Pre-Raphaelites hated all this. In addition, if you were going to be a working painter during the 19th century, most of your money would come not from these big sacred works, but from portrait painting. Before there's photography, the way painters made most of their money was painting portraits. So I'm going to present a typical portrait from the early 19th century. This is John Constable, and Mrs. Henry Pullum is his subject, 1818. And here, unlike in the Raphael cartoons, there is a relatively quote-unquote realistic representation, although again, with the face given the focus, if you notice, the dress is not realized in the same degree of detail. So realistic, but still not photographic realism, and in which the representation of the sitter is the most important thing. The reason that the painting has been created is so that the person who's paying for the painting will have a way of remembering the person who is sitting for the painting, remembering the model, and presumably displaying this portrait in a home as a marker of the owner's wealth and status as well. So, what does Rossetti do with all this? Oh, before I get to Rossetti, here's a painting from, not a painting, listen to me, an illustration from Nicholas Nickleby by Hablot Brown, one of Dickens's illustrators, and here is an representation of female beauty in distress from Nicholas Nickleby, a kind of image of stereotypical, generic Victorian standards of beauty. As is typical of Brown, there is so much going on in the painting that, unlike in the portrait, you hardly even see the facial features of the person who is nevertheless at the center of the representation. So a degree of a generic quality to this representation, as opposed to the actual portrait, which was much more specific. So this interesting tension between the specificity of portraits and the more general quality of these idealized representations. All right, finally, to Rossetti. This is his representation of the Annunciation, Ecce Ancilla Domini. Here is the maid of the Lord, the moment when the angel comes to Mary and announces that she will be the mother of Jesus. This painting caused quite a ruckus when it appeared in 1850. And from the perspective of 2022, it may not seem all that striking. But if you have in your head all of those Raphael cartoons, you might see why this caused such a stir. All that big, complicated, sculpted crowd in the Raphael paintings is gone. Instead of the beautifully arranged heights and depths, you have a painting that seems to have recognized that photography is now an option. The garment that Mary is wearing is not beautifully arranged, it's a crumpled mess. And rather than having a figure to balance her out on one side of the painting, she is cramming herself up against the wall, and and her face dominates the painting. We have the angel only in profile and harder to see, in a way that becomes the painting center. Even though the angel and the flowers are fairly conventional, this Mary doesn't look like the impassive Marys of medieval and Renaissance art, but like a woman who is truly frightened, freaked out, alarmed by what is going on. And that representation is allowed to dominate the painting in a way very uncharacteristic of the way that painting was supposed to happen in the Royal Academy with the Raphaelite cartoons. So I think of this painting as pre-Raphaelite in the sense of anti-Raphaelite, taking all the rules of Raphaelitism and throwing them out the window, except still using a sacred subject. I'm also just going to note here that for Protestant England, for Rossetti to paint an Annunciation was also quite a rebellious move, something else we might want to talk about. And here, if you think about the portrait that I showed you from Constable, this is a very different image of what one might do with a portrait painting. Now Rossetti is no longer representing a specific individual the way Constable was, a specific historical individual. This is a representation of Beatrice from Dante, and he is imagining her supposedly at the moment of her death, a moment of transfiguration, as opposed to the clean representational lines of Constable. We have a very different sense of what painting is all about. The realism, in quotes, of the earlier painting gives way to a much hazier, much more proto-impressionistic sense of portraiture. Another important detail for the 19th century was the red hair of the model, which was considered not to be beautiful by standards of 19th century taste. Here Rossetti is rebelling against that by making sure that his model has red hair and lots of it. So Rossetti is revising standards of female beauty in this, moving away from the assumptions of photographic sort of portraiture to freeing the representation from those earlier assumptions. This aspect of trying to disrupt conventions of female beauty has a racial aspect to it as well that I want to draw attention to. But first, the Blessed Damozel. So here she is, more red hair, and is her face pretty or not is kind of a question that Rossetti seems to be throwing open for his audience. What is female beauty? How do we define it? Should we be defining it? Who gets to define it? Are all questions that Rossetti seems to be interested in raising in this painting. Also, by this point, plugging into the before Raphael, the medieval motifs as well, as he is in the Beatrice painting. Now I wanted to get to, well, obviously there are racial aspects of this, lots of white people. And in the representation of Mary and the representation of Beatrice. But the Pre-Raphaelites are interested in expanding and complicating the assumption of whiteness in the representation of beauty. And an important model for them was Fanny Eaton, a Jamaican woman who became very popular among the Pre-Raphaelites in ways that are intriguing and disturbing at the same time, in that they're both interested in representing her, but also in using her. And that is something we may want to talk about. So this is Rossetti's sketch of Fanny Eaton. An example of how she is used in Pre-Raphaelite art is here. This is a painting by Simeon Solomon, 1860, called The Mother of Moses. And Solomon, a Pre-Raphaelite artist, is interestingly both gay and Jewish. So something that would certainly never have been found in earlier British art. There are no gay Jewish 18th century British painters. And Solomon here is interested in disrupting the assumed whiteness of traditional religious representation and uses Fanny Eaton, a Jamaican woman, to represent a Middle Eastern woman here. And we might wonder, is that okay or not, or how do we want to think about that? But I note that, problematic as it may have been for the Victorians, it's still an issue around racial representation, who gets to stand for whom. And I'm intrigued by Solomon's project of de-whitening religious representation, reminding the Victorians that Christianity and Judaism are both Asian religions in their origin, and trying to make sure his audience sees that, at the same time doing so by taking models who aren't Middle Eastern at all, are Jamaican. And what's that about? How does one race come to stand for another? And is that what are the costs of the project that he is undertaking? So I'm noting this, and I'd be actually very interested to get your takes. The Rossetti poems that we're going to read, Foreground Whiteness, in or I should say the Dante Gabriel Rossetti poems, Foreground Whiteness. When we get to Goblin Market, we'll want to think about how race works as well in relation to that poem. There's a lot going on in that poem. My goal here is just to indicate that the art of the Pre-Raphaelites takes place not just in an artistic world, but in a world, because it is interested in revising the representation of religious art, is going to take on issues of race that are intriguing, but also complicated and disturbing. We need to acknowledge both. Other aspects of the proto-avant-garde with the Pre-Raphaelites, they developed their own literary outlet, a little magazine called The Germ. They probably should have talked to marketing before coming up with that title, but there it is, The Germ, which lasted exactly 4 numbers, so not very long. But they use it not just to have a magazine, but to announce an aesthetic counter creed. And that becomes an important part of avant-garde movements. It's not just producing the art, but producing writing and interpretations of the art at the same time. Now, to a degree, Wordsworth had done this as well with the preface to Lyrical Ballads. I'm just saying that the PRB takes this and runs with it, although not very far. And this is going to be super important when modernism arrives, in which there are always going to be essays and venues explaining the avant-garde art. And then getting back to Bourdieu, the fact that the germ lasted only 4 numbers could be seen as typical of the avant-garde. Failure is a sign of success because it means that you are not giving into the temptations of bourgeois economy and bourgeois success. And finally, a little bit about the poetry. So 1850, the big poem that appears is Tennyson's great long elegy for Arthur Hallam, in memoriam AHH. And just a little bit from the conclusion of Tennyson's In Memoriam, in which Tennyson has spent many stanzas mourning Arthur Henry Hallam and going through every possible phase of grief and using his grief as an occasion for reflecting on major religious, political, economic, social developments of his age, and concludes, "Where of the man, Hallam, that with me trod this planet was a noble type, appearing ere the times were ripe, that friend of mine who lives in God." So now Arthur Hallam has become a type of the best that the modern era has to offer. And he appeared even before the world was ready for him. And now Hallam lives in God, that God which ever lives and loves, one God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event, to which the whole creation moves. And that is the end of In Memoriam. So, some things worth pointing out. Poetry is being used as a justification of Christian faith, even though, interestingly, Tennyson admits it's a far-off divine event, so that faith may not be as strong or secure as it once was. It's far off, but it is still there. And a belief in the sacred afterlife as a way of staying with the beloved. Also, the privileging of homosocial bonding between Tennyson and Hallam as a kind of highest in Tennyson's representation mode of social and religious life. It's not going to be marriage. It's going to be this homosocial bonding. And Tennyson continues that in his big epic, The Idols of the King, which would be appearing over the next several decades in pieces, which is another elevation of male homosocial bonding, because it's an Arthurian story, an Arthurian epic, and at its center is the Arthurian Round Table. And notoriously, the Round Table is ruined by the infidelity of Guinevere with Lancelot. Now, a little note, this makes Idols of the King sound more misogynistic than I think it actually is. I think Tennyson ultimately, intentionally or not, writes the Idols of the King as a kind of critique of certain forms of toxic masculinity for the Victorians. But that's a different lecture. Just, I don't want you to write off Idols of the King. It's a more interesting epic than it might sound. But when Rossetti writes, he is positioning himself against Tennyson's Christian, homosocial, and somewhat dogmatic the representation in Memoriam. So, thinking about the Blessed Damozel. Some questions, I'm not going to answer them, just throwing them out as spurs to thought. The poem has three voices: the narrator, the damozel, and the lover. Where are they in relation to each other? Meaning, and I mean this very literally, if you were to film this, where would they be positioned? And why might that matter? How can you describe the power relations between the damozel and her lover? So to disrupt the sense, oh, this is just a love story, this is about power as well. And how would you describe that power? And then what does this poem do to Christianity? Big question there, lots of answers. Jenny. How does Jenny revise the traditional figure of the muse? What has happened to the muse in this poem? It's a fair question about the Blessed Damozel as well. So you might want to think about Hallam as Tennyson's muse. Think in the romantic poetry that you may have read by Wordsworth or Keats or Shelley, what happens to the muse in those poems, and what's going on with the muse in Rossetti. Why does the speaker put gold in Jenny's hair, which we also hear is blonde? So interesting opportunity to think about the racial issues I was bringing up earlier. Why is it important that Jenny has white skin and blonde hair? How would it be different otherwise? And why does Rossetti not let Jenny speak in the poem? And finally, Goblin Market. In Goblin Market, we hear of a dead woman named Jeannie, and I think it's not a coincidence that Christina Rossetti writes Goblin Market in response to her brother Dante Gabriel's poem, Jenny. And I haven't talked much about Christina because she was a theologian and a poet, did not produce art in the same way. But I think that a lot of her writing engages in really important and interestingly critical ways with the work of Dante Gabriel. And I want to catch me if I ever say, I really should be careful to say Dante Gabriel and Christina and not assume that Rossetti stands for one or the other. Second, what is the goblins' endgame? Why are they doing what they do? And then three, Laura assumes, once you read the poem, this will make sense, that Lizzie has eaten the goblin fruit, as she, Laura, has. Why doesn't Lizzie tell her the truth, that she has not actually eaten the goblin fruit? And just to think about. And then Dante Gabriel did illustrate Goblin Market for Christina. And here is the woodcut he did. And here is Laura cutting her hair for the goblins, while in the upper left-hand corner, Lizzie is watching what's going on. And you can see that one of the goblins is actually beckoning her with a finger. I'm going to represent this, think about this as a representation of what you see in the poem. Is Dante Gabriel just illustrating the poem? Is he recognizing that his sister is criticizing him, possibly in a way? Is he trying to steal interpretation back from his sister in this representation? Big, complex questions. I don't have clear answers, but they're useful, and thinking about complicated questions is what literary criticism is all about. All right, I'm going to be quiet and really looking forward to meeting with you over Zoom and to talking about these really complicated, disturbing, vexing poems. Take care.